The slap echoed through business class like a thunderclap, snapping heads up from iPads and newspapers. Every eye in the cabin locked onto the unfolding scene. Leanna Mercer's hand still suspended in the air, her perfectly made-up face twisted with rage, and Rosne Patel's head turned slightly by the impact, a red mark blooming across her cheek. "I've had enough of your attitude," Leanna hissed, her flight attendant's smile abandoned for raw contempt. "Just because you managed to score a ticket up here doesn't mean you can act like you own the place." The cabin froze in collective shock. Even at 37,000 feet, certain boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. Physical assault of a passenger by crew was so far beyond the pale that several travelers blinked in disbelief, wondering if they'd actually witnessed what had just happened. Rosna touched her cheek gently, her expression unnervingly calm for someone who'd just been assaulted. At 42, dressed in a simple blue kurta and jeans, she wore minimal jewelry and carried herself with quiet confidence. Without a word, she reached for her phone. "What are you doing?" Leanna demanded, suddenly aware of the stunned silence around them. "You can't use your phone during flight." Ignoring her, Rosin dialed a number, waiting as it connected. "This is a direct violation of safety protocols," Leanna continued, panic edging into her voice, as the reality of her actions began to penetrate her anger. "Put that away immediately, or I'll have you—" "Hello, V," Rosin said quietly into the phone, her slight accent lilting the words. "Yes, I'm on the flight. There's been an incident. A flight attendant named Leanna Mercer just slapped me across the face." A pause. "No, I'm fine, physically at least." Another pause. "Yes, I understand. I'll tell the captain to expect your call." Rosin ended the call and looked up at Leanna, whose porcelain complexion had gone ashen. Around them, several passengers were openly recording on their phones now, sensing that they were witnessing something consequential. "Who exactly was that?" Leanna asked, her earlier aggression withering under a growing sense of dread. "That was my husband," Rosna replied simply. "V. Rajan." The name hung in the air like a guillotine blade. V. Rajan, founder and CEO of Meridian Airways, the very airline whose uniform Leanna wore with such pride and, until moments ago, such arrogance. The confrontation hadn't materialized from nowhere. It had built over the previous 2 hours, from the moment Rosna had stepped onto the plane and Leanna's expression had soured at the sight of a dark-skinned woman in casual clothing approaching the business-class cabin. "Excuse me," Leanna had said with exaggerated patience, blocking Rosna's path. "Economy boarding is through the rear entrance." Rosna had simply extended her boarding pass. "I'm in 3A business class." Leanna had examined the ticket with theatrical skepticism. "This is a business class seat. Are you sure you're on the right flight?" "Quite sure," Rosin had replied mildly. Grudgingly, Leanna had allowed her to pass, but the microaggressions continued. When serving pre-flight drinks, she'd skipped Rosna entirely. When distributing hot towels, she'd practically thrown Rosna's onto her tray. When taking meal orders, she'd skeptically repeated Rosna's selection, as if confirming she understood how fine dining worked. "The black cod? With the wine pairing?" Leanna had asked, eyebrows raised. "You understand that's included in your ticket price?" "Yes," Rosna had answered simply. "I'd like the cod." Each exchange had carried the same subtext. "You don't belong here." Throughout it all, Rosna had maintained her composure, responding with minimal words, and refusing to engage with the bait. Her restraint had seemingly fueled Leanna's irritation, escalating to passive-aggressive comments about certain passengers who might be more comfortable in economy. The breaking point had come when Rosna had attempted to use the business-class lavatory. Leanna had deliberately stepped into her path. "The call button is for emergencies only," she'd snapped, though Rosin hadn't pressed any button. "I didn't call for assistance," Rosna had explained. "I'm just going to the restroom." "Don't lie to me," Leanna had retorted. "I saw your light come on. This isn't some budget hotel where you can summon the help whenever you want." The condescension had been blatant enough that several nearby passengers had shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A silver-haired man across the aisle had lowered his Financial Times to observe the interaction. "I didn't press any button," Rosna had repeated, still unfailingly polite. "Perhaps it was another passenger?" "I know exactly what kind of passenger you are," Liana had hissed, leaning in close enough that only Rosin and those immediately adjacent could hear. "Just because you found yourself a business-class ticket doesn't mean you understand how to behave up here with civilized people." And then, when Rosna had attempted to step around her toward the lavatory, Liana had reached out and delivered the slap that had stunned the cabin into silence. Now, as recognition of Rosna's identity rippled through the aircraft, the intercom crackled to life. "This is Captain Reynolds speaking. Would Flight Attendant Mercer please report to the cockpit immediately?" Liana stood frozen, her mind racing through the implications. V. Rajan wasn't just the CEO. He was the founder, majority shareholder, and public face of Meridian Airways. His meteoric rise from a middle-class background in Mumbai to aviation magnate made him a regular feature in business publications. His well-documented focus on customer service and employee conduct was legendary within the industry, and Liana had just slapped his wife across the face. "I didn't know," she whispered, as if this somehow mitigated her actions. "Would that have made a difference?" Rosin asked quietly. "If I were just another passenger? Would it have been acceptable to treat me this way?" The question hung unanswered, as the second flight attendant Jason appeared at Liana's elbow. "The captain needs you now," he murmured urgently. Then to Rosna, "Ma'am, I cannot apologize enough. Can I get you anything? Ice for your cheek, perhaps?" "I'm fine, thank you," Rosna replied with the same composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. As Liana was led away, the silver-haired man across the aisle leaned toward Rosna. "I should have said something sooner," he said, genuine regret in his voice. Her behavior was appalling from the start. Rosny nodded acknowledgement but offered no absolution. "Silence is its own statement," she observed. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was holding a satellite phone with a grim expression. "Mr. Rajan would like to speak with you," he said, handing the device to a visibly trembling Liana. "Sir, I can explain," she began. "Ms. Mercer," the voice cut her off with steely precision. "I've just watched video footage of you assaulting my wife. The explanation I'm interested in is this. What could possibly make a Meridian Airways employee believe they have the right to lay hands on any passenger, regardless of who they are?" Liana's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. "Your silence speaks volumes," Rajan continued. "Upon landing in Singapore, you will be met by airline security and local police. You will surrender your credentials and be escorted from the premises. Consider your employment with Meridian Airways terminated, effective immediately." "Mr. Rajan, please," Liana finally managed, desperation edging her voice. "It was a misunderstanding. If I'd known she was your wife—" "That is precisely the problem," Rajan interrupted, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You believed that knowledge of a passenger's status or connections should determine how they're treated. That fundamentally violates everything Meridian stands for." The line went dead. Captain Reynolds reclaimed the phone, his expression making it clear he'd heard every word. "For the remainder of the flight, you'll be confined to the crew rest area," he informed her. "Jason will handle business class service. I suggest you use the time to consider the repercussions of your actions, both professional and potentially legal." As Liana was escorted to the isolated crew compartment, the reality of her situation began to sink in. 15 years as a flight attendant, gone. The prestige of international routes, the layovers in luxury hotels, the entire career she'd built, all evaporated in a single moment of unchecked prejudice. Back in the cabin, service resumed with conspicuous attentiveness. Jason seemed determined to single-handedly repair the airline's reputation through sheer solicitousness, offering Rosny everything from extra pillows to premium champagne. "Please," she eventually said, gently declining yet another offer of special treatment. "Just treat me like any other passenger. That's all I ever wanted." The remainder of the 13-hour flight passed without further incident. Passengers occasionally glanced at Rosna with a mixture of curiosity and respect, but no one approached her directly. The cabin settled into an uneasy calm, the earlier confrontation hanging in the air like a cautionary tale. As the aircraft began its descent into Singapore Changi Airport, the intercom activated one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes. Upon arrival, we ask that all passengers remain seated until a special delegation has boarded the aircraft. We apologize for any delay this may cause to your journey." When the aircraft doors opened at the gate, the special delegation became immediately apparent. V. Rajan himself stood in the jetway, flanked by two airport security officers and a woman in a Meridian Airways executive uniform. At 55, Rajan cut an imposing figure, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his expression carved from granite. He boarded the aircraft and moved directly to Rosna's seat, kneeling beside her to examine the faint red mark still visible on her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked, his public persona set aside for genuine concern. "I'm fine," she assured him. "It was more shocking than painful." Rajan nodded, squeezing her hand before rising to his full height and turning toward the crew area. "Bring her out," he instructed. When Liana emerged, escorted by Jason, she looked nothing like the imperious figure who had dominated the cabin hours earlier. Her uniform was wrinkled, her makeup smudged by tears. Her previously confident posture collapsed into itself. "Ms. Mercer," Rajan addressed her, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "I wanted to deliver this personally." He handed her an envelope. "This is your formal termination notice, along with a notification that Meridian Airways will be pursuing civil action for assault and violation of our passenger covenant. The Singapore police will escort you from the terminal and take your statement regarding the incident." Liana stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. "Sir, please," she whispered. "My entire career, 15 years of service." "15 years," Rajan repeated, cutting her off. "15 years during which you presumably encountered thousands of passengers from different backgrounds. How many did you treat the way you treated my wife today? How many felt belittled, unwelcome, or unworthy because they didn't match your profile of who belonged in premium cabins?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Around the cabin, several passengers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in similar situations they'd witnessed and ignored. "Meridian's first principle is that every passenger deserves respect, regardless of appearance, accent, or attire," Rajan continued, addressing not just Liana, but the entire cabin. "Not because they might secretly be married to the CEO, but because basic human dignity shouldn't be a premium perk." He turned to the security officers. "Please escort Ms. Mercer from the aircraft." As Liana was led away, still clutching the termination notice, Rajan addressed the remaining passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unusual intervention and the delay to your deplaning. Meridian Airways was founded on the belief that luxury travel should be an experience of exceptional service for all who choose it. Today, we failed to uphold that standard. For that, I am deeply sorry." His formal apology delivered, Rajan returned his attention to Rosna, helping her gather her belongings. Together they exited the aircraft first, leaving behind a cabin full of passengers with much to consider about what they'd witnessed. 3 months later, Meridian Airways launched a new training program for all customer-facing staff, centered on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. The case study at its core was anonymized but unmistakable to anyone who had been following aviation news. A flight attendant who had made assumptions about a passenger based solely on appearance, escalating from subtle discrimination to outright assault. The program, developed in consultation with diversity specialists and customer service experts, quickly became industry-leading. Other airlines began licensing the curriculum, recognizing its value in an increasingly global market where passengers didn't fit neat demographic profiles. Lyanna Mercer eventually found work as a hotel receptionist, a significant step down in both prestige and compensation from her former career. The civil suit was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, but the terms included a public apology and community service hours at organizations serving immigrant communities. As for Rosna, she continued her work as a pediatric surgeon at Singapore General Hospital, her encounter with Lyanna becoming a footnote rather than a defining moment. When occasionally asked about the incident by colleagues who'd recognized her from media coverage, she offered the same perspective she'd given the silver-haired passenger on the flight. "The problem wasn't that she didn't know who I was," she would explain. "The problem was that she thought she needed to know who I was to determine whether I deserved to be treated with dignity." It was a lesson that reached far beyond one flight attendant or one airline. In premium cabins and economy sections alike, it served as a reminder that respect shouldn't be a function of status, and that in an age where anyone might be recording, accountability for its absence could arrive with the swiftness of a slap and the finality of a termination notice. As Rosna returned to her seat with her water, she found herself reflecting on the ripple effects of that single confrontation. What had been a deeply personal humiliation had catalyzed institutional change that was now benefiting countless passengers who would never know the story behind it. Her phone contained dozens of messages from women, particularly women of color, who had reached out after the incident went public, sharing their own experiences of being questioned, challenged, or made to feel unwelcome in premium spaces. Flight cabins, hotel lobbies, exclusive restaurants, high-end retail stores. The geography of prejudice extended far beyond aviation, creating invisible barriers that countless individuals navigated daily. The slap that had stunned business class into silence had merely been the visible culmination of attitudes typically expressed in subtler forms. The slightly delayed service, the perfunctory rather than genuine smile, the double-checking of credentials, the assumption of non-belonging. For every Lyanna Mercer whose bias erupted into undeniable physical expression, thousands of others maintained plausible deniability while enforcing the same unwritten boundaries. What made Meridian's response significant wasn't just the termination of a single problematic employee, but the recognition that the problem was systemic rather than individual. The airline had asked itself the uncomfortable question: what conditions had allowed Lyanna to believe her behavior was acceptable in the first place?